Oh my, as I live and breathe, here I am, the one, the only Mark Heckler. How the heck
Things
are
you
you, buddy?
things you see when you don't have a stick, right?
Yeah, well, this is as close as I can get to having coffee with you these days, is wearing a coffee themed T-shirt because we're not in the same. I was going to ask you, and how many cups of coffee have you had today, and why is that not enough?
I lost count. That's the first part of that. And
Smart.
the second is because it's never enough. So next question.
Well, and I'm blanking on the name of this movie, but it was Ryan Reynolds was a voice actor in it, and he said, "This isn't an addiction. I can stop whenever I want. I just don't want to stop about coffee." So there you go. So it's all good. Oh, we already have people saying hello to us. So
Oh, hey,
hello,
hi.
Arnold, and hello, Unboo. It's great to have you here. Thanks. Good to see you. Always fun.
Yeah.
So, Mark, I am just so excited I get a chance to hang out with you here today that, we're
Boys.
going to go ahead and do some fun stuff here. Why don't you go ahead and get your screen share kicked up, and then I'll figure out what buttons I got to press to actually make that appear. But have you been out flying at all lately, by the way? I meant to ask you that last time we were on text exchange.
Not recently enough.
Okay.
The last time I went, I think was Sunday morning. I got out for a really quick short flight early morning.
Okay.
Let me see if I can figure out how to. I moved you over there, so I wouldn't have you.
Oh, yeah. We don't want to do the Infinity screen.
Yeah.
Infinity pools are nice, but not on a live stream, for sure.
Present, share screen. Boom.
Oh, wow. All the way from India. Yes, that is a hike. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate that.
Right.
And it's, I'm sure, much warmer than it is for me. We've got snowstorms apparently coming our way. And so I'm not even going to try to pronounce Shomer 2009. Hello. Thank you for joining us. Glad to have you. So I'm actually excited that you and I are going to be in the same meet space next week. I'm looking forward to seeing you at DevNexus, by the way. I just want to put that plug out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing that they let us, if I do that, then I can't see you. It's amazing that they let us leave our houses and
Right.
show up in public spaces. Yeah, looking forward to that. That's going to be nice.
Absolutely. Well, I know you and I could vamp for probably the next hour, and that's really not the point of this. We really should let you do what you want to do. So let me go ahead and add that in here, and I'm just going to move you over so that when I pop back in, I'm not over you. So basically, this will work. Please ask questions in the comments. I know a few of you are already hopping in there, so I'll keep my eyes on the comments, and I'll occasionally interject myself here with anything that comes up in there. So go ahead and take advantage of that feature there on YouTube or Twitch, wherever you're joining us from, and I'll do my best to inject that into Mark's conversation here. Otherwise, I know he and I will wrap up with some more witty banter about coffee and other related things, whatever else crops up in our chat channel. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you, my friend. So have at it. Thanks for joining us.
Right. Well, I would just like to qualify that. I'm not sure we can deliver on the witty, but we can deliver on banter. So we'll
good point. I should have under promised and over delivered. So there will be banter.
Yes.
We'll leave it up to the audience as to whether it was witty or not.
And now thanks Ted Lasso, all I can think of when I hear banter is BANTR on the jerseys. But oh well.
Right.
Anyway,
we could talk about Ted Lasso too. We'll talk about that when we come back. That's probably makes more sense.
We will do that. That, coffee, flying, anything. I mean, it's all good.
Absolutely.
And DevNexus, meeting up at conferences, drinking coffee where other people actually hand us wonderful coffee. That's a nice thing. Right now, I hope everyone brought their coffee. I have mine here. So I find though that the more coffee I drink, which as Nate knows, we consume a lot of coffee, the raspier I get and the more I sound like this. So what I do is I mix in coffee. I'll drink some of that and then I'll switch to water where I can clarify my vocal cords, whatever. Anyway,
important to stay hydrated.
Yeah, you dehydrate, then rehydrate. Yeah, it's a cruel, vicious cycle. But here we go. Okay.
So have at it, my friend.
This is a talk that I like to call Build Better, Deploy Faster. And what it involves is bringing together Spring Boot and Spring Cloud in the cloud for frictionless, as I say here, frictionless Kubernetes-based microservices. That's a huge mouthful, but it all is kind of important, right? That's why the long title. That, and of course, I work with Spring, which means that you've got to have long method names, long title. It's part and parcel, right? My name, though, is Mark Heckler, as Nate alluded. Nate and I go way back. He still admits he knows me, so that's a good thing, at least in most circles. So I appreciate that, Nate. Appreciate you. But I am a principal cloud advocate of Java and JVM languages with Microsoft. I was actually a teammate and colleague of Nate's. I worked at Pivotal and then VMware. Worked on Spring with Spring, delivered talks on Spring. Still doing that. I just get to have a production cloud that I like to play with and get to kind of straddle both sides of that fence. So it's all good. But I'm still working with a lot of the same people, which is awesome, as well as a new cohort. So all good. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, as Nate mentioned, drop them into the chat. I will get on a tear and I'll go through and I'll be hitting things kind of fast and furious for a while for a clip. And then we'll stop and we'll address some questions and we'll do that until we run out of time or coffee or both. But if you think of anything after the fact, it happens to me every time. 5 minutes after I disconnect, I think, oh, that was the question I really wanted to ask. That's fine. Reach out to me via email or better yet on Twitter. I'm also on Mastodon and MKHeck at, I think it's mastodon.cloud. But Twitter's kind of the center of gravity. You know, if you start there, then you can branch out and hit me in many other ways. It's just that's probably the fastest way to get a hold of me and get a response. And I'm already getting wispy here, so I'm going to go back to the water. So a little bit about me. I am an architect and developer by trade, an advocate, as you are obviously well aware now. I have authored, actually, I've contributed content and code to several books. I've co-authored a couple of books, and I have solo authored a book, which I am very proud of, which I'll mention here in momentarily and give you more information about. I am also a Java champion, Java 1 Rockstar, Kotlin developer expert, a few other honors and awards, which I truly appreciate, but still mean that I have to get my own coffee. Which actually is not a bad thing now that I think about it. So that's not bad. Also, as Nate mentioned, I'm a licensed instrument rated pilot because I think it's good to challenge your brain in different ways, and it gives you a different perspective, literally a different perspective on things when you're several thousand feet in the air. And of course, we do use feet because this is the U.S. I often jokingly tell people that, but in aviation, it's kind of an interesting melange of terms and measurements because we'll measure temp in Celsius just by default. We measure wind speed in knots. We measure distances in statute miles. We measure speed in knots as well. It's this crazy mix, this crazy amalgam of stuff. So it keeps, I guess, keeps you on your toes. The latest book, as I mentioned, is Spring Boot Up and Running. It's an O'Reilly book that I wrote. And everything in there other than the data feed application. I built an application to feed data to every other example that I use throughout the book. I wrote in Java and Kotlin. So if you're interested in kind of seeing how the other F lives, you can do that. If you want to follow the book on Twitter, you can. And if you want to maybe get a free peek into the book, you can follow the link. And that will take you to O'Reilly's site for, I think it's a week trial of Safari Books Online. Or you can just check it out at a bookstore, library, whatever. All good. Or not. So the agenda for today, I like to start with kind of like, here's where I'm trying to head, hoping to head, and see how close we come up with it. But first, a bit of context, because I feel context is important. I like to establish where we're going before we jump in, because otherwise you don't know how far off the mark. Or anyway, when you get there. And then we'll code, because I like to show things in code. That's where we live, right? As developers, we spend most of our time in an IDE working with code, and then we deploy, right? So coding and deployment, coding and clouding, as I like to say. And we'll spend a lot of our time coding because I think it's sort of like the context is important for the next phase. And then, well, let's just get started. What the heck? So with Spring Cloud was created and is maintained and extended, and it evolves to solve problems, right? Like most good software projects do. And Spring Cloud encompasses a lot of different things, but Spring Cloud as a concept is basically meant to make your Spring Boot applications cloud native, good cloud residents, and to enable them to work together, find each other, provide information to each other, and generally just grease the skids for your applications to work as a large, coherent, distributed system without a lot of pain on your part, right? Because the whole ethos of Spring is to make life easier for developers and more productive for developers. I like to call it a developer first approach, or giving developers superpowers. And either way, it seems like a reasonable description. So several years ago, there was a thing called the 12-factor apps, and that kind of fell out of favor because I think marketing got a hold of it. And as often happens with good concepts, It kind of lost a lot of its, I guess, at least concise meanings. But the concepts were good, and a lot of the things that Spring Cloud kind of harkens to are needs, are valid, proven needs when it comes to complex distributed systems. So things like configuration. Every application has certain properties that it uses, certain parameters that it might take advantage of in order to find a database that it needs. I started to say wants your application. Well, someday maybe wants. But your application needs to connect with and to be able to store and retrieve data from, query and things like that. You'll have configuration for messaging platform connection strings and things like that. And all of those things are valid, but in a monolith, it's problematic to have them in there, because if anything changes, what do you have to do? You have to change it in the code base. You have to rebuild, retest, and assuming everything passes, then redeploy. And that's if you have one of something. As soon as you look at distributed systems, you can have multiple instances of anything. So for instance, if you have a service that you need to scale out to 10 instances of it, now if you need to make a change, you have to change it in 10 different places. Or you have to have some mechanism for updating it in one place and having all of those instances refresh. And that's where externalizing your configuration becomes a very, very big deal. It also allows you to do things like version control it, because most of those properties, in fact, you could say all of those properties, are basically what we would consider key value pairs. For this, substitute this value. For this, use this connection string. And in doing that, you need a way to keep track of when that changes, who changed it, maybe encrypt it, decrypt it, things like that. And externalizing it allows you to put that mechanism in a single place and touch that once and have a force multiplier on your system. And that's where something like the Spring Cloud config server comes into being. Again, all these things that I'm going to be talking about, or at least most of them, have many ways to accomplish the goal, but I'm going to be talking about kind of the primary driver behind it, the primary solution. And all of these are variations on a theme. But the config server serves as probably the preeminent example of how to externalize your configuration within a Spring Cloud context. Then you need some way, and I mentioned it kind of in passing, if you have 10 instances of a service and you're in a complex distributed system, you let's say you have 10 instances of every service sitting out there, and you have 3, 30, 500 services that are running, and then multiple instances of each of those. If service A needs to find an instance of service B, then it has to know where to look. And you can't hard code that, because if an instance of service B goes down and another one springs up in a different place, if you've hard coded that in service A, it can't find its replacement, the replacement service B. So you need some way of having an external service registry where lookups can be performed, and you can locate, all of the services can locate each other and decouple that. So that once you do an initial lookup, if anything happens, if the service registry goes down, then the distributed system can still continue to function, because it's all about resilience. Then you look at things like backing services, and these are kind of back-end services, if you will, that produce a lot of value, right? They crunch a lot of numbers, they retrieve a lot of things, they manipulate data, they produce a valid package of information, or a product, if you will, for other services to consume. Which kind of brings us to the next one, which is consuming services. And these are by no means exclusive. You have some services that consume data from others, and then they in turn expose that information that they've processed and done something with, and manipulated and refined. But certainly you can kind of see this kind of interaction and distinction of duties in many cases. And then, of course, you want some kind of a gateway service, because if, as the earlier example that I mentioned, is what you have running in your production environment, where 300 or 500 services are running, you don't want to expose an endpoint or endpoints to all of those to the outside world. That would be chaos. That would be madness. It would also make securing all of those things very, very difficult. So a gateway service allows you a single point of entry, so to speak. It allows you to limit the rate of access. It allows you to secure access from and to different resources. So it allows you to have a bit of control over the chaos in terms of interaction with your distributed system. I haven't even touched, and I probably won't touch much on tracing and load balancing and circuit breaking and reactive streams and how to secure all of this. But I want to focus on the key bits, right? Because the other things, while they're very essential, while they're very important, they build out around all of these things and are used to complement all of these things. So these are kind of the in my mind, the heavy hitters, the things that we'll talk about the most. So let's code. Time for a quick drink. And by the way, everybody does recognize Moss, right? Maurice Moss. Okay, I'll check the comments later, but let's hope that's not a no. Okay, so I'm going to start off here today. And when it comes to a distributed system, a complex system, there are many ways to start, right? But the best way to start, in my opinion, to show you kind of the myriad capabilities of a Spring Cloud-based distributed system is to start with the Spring Initializer. And I'm going to start off by creating a config server. So I'm going to use Maven and Java as my my project build system in my language. Use the current version of boot, which is 3.0.5, and I'm going to change this to the hecklers because why not? And I'm going to make this my config service. And that's fine, config. And I'm going to bring in the dependency. Whoops, wrong button. Move my keyboard ever so slightly, and now my fingers are finding the wrong keys. Silly fingers. And I'm going to just select the config server dependency, and I'm going to generate that. And let's drop that right on the desktop. And we'll open that. And of course, it opened it in the wrong, on the wrong screen. There we go. Let's bring that up in the middle. Okay, so I like you to see what I'm seeing as much as possible. You know, with multiple screens and trying to keep track of everything, it gets a little tough, but I want to kind of keep the focus here. So let's see. All right, the first thing I want to do, first thing I like to do is bring up the POM. As you can see, it just has the single dependency, but that's enough for what we want to do here. I actually want to bring up my application properties, and then I want to set up the server port 8888. So this is running on the local port. So when you deploy this to the cloud, obviously this isn't necessarily a thing, but when we're running this locally, as we do a lot of times in development, this is very important to provide a bit of information. So like our Spring Cloud config server get URI, I'm going to point this to a directory here on my home machine. Let's see, that's under dev, session, 2 S's, session repos, and build better config. Now, what is out here? I guess let me stop for just a second here, and we'll come back to that. So I have some configuration files, and you can set these up as properties, but in many cases it makes a lot of sense to create YAML files, because this is YAML not in the terms of Kubernetes, where it's sprawling YAML that we all get lost and we cry and we just wonder what happened to us, and we question our own life choices. But this is YAML as it's intended to be, short, sweet, and to the point, very concise. If I, for instance, pull up the, let's do a cat of application.yaml, we can see that we have just a few properties here, and that's it. So it's nice and easy to keep track of. Everything is where we want it. And we can see that that's not a terrible thing. So let's see. I'll come back to this because I do want to return to this here in a minute. But I wanted you to see what happens with the config server is that if for any application that starts, it will go and pull properties, common properties. The config server will serve them up from the application.yaml. So any properties that are defined for all applications, it will pull those properties. Now, if a service is identified as let's say a weather service, and it's running with the local profile, it will get all of these properties. So, and it will get the application properties, the generic application properties. If it's not running with a local profile, it will just get all the default weather service properties plus any default properties for application. If there are more specific properties that are overridden, these override this because more specific wins. So it allows you to layer those properties, and which kind of allows you to provide valuable properties at every level that is necessary and that makes sense, override when necessary, when appropriate, and the service gets what it needs to start. Now, this is our config server. So I'm going to just open our application itself, and I'm going to add enable config server, and we'll start this. Now, I want to show you a couple things. I'm going to run this once just from the IDE, and I will give you a quick, let's see if I can, that's fine. Let's do that. So localhost 8888, application, well, helps if you don't have a typo. If you leave that slash in there. There we go. Okay, so these are the application properties that every application that contacts the config service and says, give me properties, will get, right? Server port set to 0, which means it will go ahead and just find a random port unless it provides a specific port. That's a Spring Bootism. Server shutdown is set to graceful, logging, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the one thing that I do want to point out is this AVWX token. Now, this is an encrypted value. Right now, I don't have a key specified. So it will come back and it will tell me right off the bat, hey, this is invalid. And it shows nothing. It's not applicable. But I know there's a property out there for that. I know it's defined. What I need to do is enable that, enable Java cryptography engine, because config service includes that by default. So it includes a capability, I should say, to encrypt and decrypt encrypted values. So let me go ahead and I will stop that. And then I want to run this. Let's see, do I have here? I should have that set up there. So let's find out. I was actually in config service. So let me do a maven w spring boot run, and we'll find out if I don't have that already enabled. Then I will find out very shortly and we will enable it. So once this comes up, what I should see is that decrypted value. Now, please don't take my key here, my token. It doesn't matter. I'm going to refresh it anyway right after the talk. But let's find out. And there it is. So you can see that when we have JCE enabled here, or the support for it enabled, we can decrypt that and provide that. So that data is sitting out there at rest. Probably not the best thing. It's still far better that it's encrypted. But we'll talk about ways when you deploy to the cloud, to production across multiple regions around the globe, a better way of doing that perhaps. But that gets us started, right? So it allows us to encrypt, decrypt those values and serve them up to any service that may be asking for them. So that's our config service. It's a very kind of whirlwind tour, but I want to go ahead and get started now in our discovery. Oh, actually, before I do that, let me show you one more thing. I tend to get excited and get ahead of myself, but I want to slow down just a moment here. So for instance, if we look at we have a weather service. I mentioned that. So weather service default. And we see that we have properties that are served up specific to our weather service. If I want to go and say, hey, look, if we're running this local, is there anything additional that we should have specifically? And of course we do. I actually need to update this. I still have some Zipkin and Sleuth stuff out there. I have updated some of this to some degree, but that's still on the agenda for, probably while I'm in Atlanta. But we'll see. So this gives you an idea of how it serves up these properties to the different services that contact it. For instance, if you want to look at the gateway service, which I will be doing here in a bit, we can see that there are routes and predicates and URIs that are defined so that we can get to those services via our gateway. And all this is externalized. So you can update it in one place, refresh, and you're propagating it throughout your entire system, which is phenomenal. So let's go back now. And let's create our next service, which is our discovery service, because that will help our wayward services find each other in our distributed system. So let's see, discovery, we'll call this disco. All right. Now I don't need this to be a config server, so I'm going to remove that. But what I do want it to be is a config client. And what I also want it to be is a Eureka server or a discovery server. And that way it can act as a service registry and of course provide the dashboard so we can see what's happening behind the scenes with our service portfolio. And I'm getting dry again. So while I generate that, I'm going to take a drink. Much better. Okay, so let's save that down. I'll go back to here. Let's unzip that. We'll open that. Here is our discovery service. So in our application properties, There we go. What I want to do is define the Spring application name, and this is how it will identify itself, or any instance of this service will identify itself to the config service and say, give me properties that are related specifically to discovery service, and then any generic properties that apply to all services. And then, of course, I need to indicate the Spring config import. We're going to point to a config server, and that config server is located at HTTP. Again, I'm running this locally, so it's localhost 8888. Easy peasy. And then we go to our application code itself, and I'm just going to enable Eureka server, and we'll run that. So far, not a lot of code, right? And that's the thing. When you externalize your configuration, and I like to point back to Spring Boot's auto config for a lot of this, because with any kind of auto configuration, many logical assumptions are made, many rational choices are made based on your code, your annotations, your properties, your class path, and all of these things come together to make this maximally impactful, but with minimal impact on us as developers. So once we have this started, we should be able to go to localhost 8761 and see our Eureka dashboard. Ooh, that's zoomed in. All right. Now there's actually really some good information here. Not yet, because we've only spun this up. So I point out several different things that are kind of interesting here, but the big thing that's interesting that we'll want to keep a close look at generally are the replicas. And in this case, our directory service replicas. I'm only running one instance. You would not do this in production, but I am only running one instance. So it'll give us some red messages there and say, hey, you're not in a secure and safe environment. You're not in a resilient and redundant environment here. You're just running one. That's fine. Timeouts will be an issue because I may be refreshing the applications at different sequence or different intervals than what Eureka refreshes. That's fine for the demo. Again, these are things that don't really matter for what I'm showing you, but just be aware they will pop up there. But this is the biggest thing right here, which is the instances currently registered. And this is where you will see your portfolio of microservices grow. So you'll have your name of your service and then the instances and the locations on where to find them. We don't have anything there yet, but we will put those there next. And that's kind of the whirlwind tour of Eureka and Discovery Service. The next thing I want to do is start building out our portfolio of microservices. So I am going to, again, licensed pilot, so this kind of stuff fascinates me. So I'm going to create some services, and these services, at least a couple of them, will reach out to the outside world and pull in some information. Because even a distributed system is not an island. Many times you're going to be reaching out and hitting external APIs, and I want to show you that's obviously not a problem at all with Spring Cloud-based applications. So we'll have an airport service here, airports, and we don't want this to be a Eureka server. However, we want it to be a discovery client, right? That kind of makes sense. We have our config client there. I want to use reactive web. I'm also going to bring in actuator, and that's kind of to get a liveness check and to make sure everything is running okay. And then I also want to bring in reactive MongoDB because I need a database to support a few things that I want to do with this particular single application. And it's easy to wrap in. So I'm going to go ahead and generate that application now, and we'll drop that same place out on the desktop and open that up. And the longest part of this is waiting for things to unzip and get open here, and IntelliJ to refresh its indices. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my application properties again. And application properties, by the way, is kind of where you put the initialization or the sensible defaults, right? So again, we have our Spring application name, and this is our airport service, and that's how it will identify itself to the config service. And then our Spring config import, config server, HTTP, once again, localhost 8888. Now, sometimes I get the question, and I may have gotten it already, but I want to address this now. Why wouldn't we just have everything look up everything else in the discovery server, including discovery service, including our config service? And you can do that. You can have everything go through the discovery service to find the config service, and that's one way to do it. By doing that, however, your discovery service won't be able to necessarily get its properties from your config service. I don't want to make too harsh a dichotomy here, but typically you have you either go config service or config first or discovery first. This is kind of the way I do it, but there are pros and cons, trade-offs each way. It is what it is. When we're doing this locally, it's more of a dichotomy than you would see when we deploy to the cloud. And I'll show you that later as well. So if we go here to our code, let's get started. Now, the first thing I want to do, since I'm going to be accessing an external API, is just to create a web client bean. And we'll just call this client return web client.create. And I want to point this to https://avwx aviation weather.rest API stations, I believe. And that station maybe, and that gets us to where we need to go to pull up our station information or our airport information. Now, I like to start off, other than that, I like to start off with our domain, because the domain is kind of what defines what you do with your application. And this is going to be fairly straightforward domain. I'm going to just use records here to create a record for airport, and then a record for, actually, I want to do time on the weather stuff, so it will be a runway, because every airport has has at least one runway. Usually it's at least two, and I'll explain that here in a moment as well. So each runway, we have a couple of identifiers here. So string ident 1 and string ident 2. Now, the way, and actually I should go ahead and add in a couple more things, because I actually see that I can bring in length in feet and width in feet. Now, a bit of information about that, because when you have a runway, typically you are able to operate from either direction. And the reason that gives you versatility is because you have the same strip of pavement, right? So if the winds are coming out of, let's say it's an east-west runway, so it's 090 or 90 degrees, and it's 270 degrees going back the other way. So if the wind's coming directly out of the west, you'll land into the wind. It makes for a shorter landing. Also a shorter takeoff, actually, because you're taking off into the wind. The other way, if the wind's coming from the east, you'll land on 090 or the 90-degree runway, and you'll take off in the same runway. So it's the same strip of pavement. You keep it in the same conditions. So typically you can take off either direction. Once in a while, there's some kind of an issue with surroundings, like mountains or buildings or whatever. But generally, you can take off either direction. And that's your ident 1 and ident 2. It's exactly 180 degrees out because the runway doesn't bend in the middle. So, and then you'll have length and width, which define that as well. For an airport, we want to have an ICAO code, right? And that's our identifier, International Civil Aviation Organization. I had to something to think about that. And then we'll have information like the city and the state in which it's located, and then elevation in feet. And by the way, some of these member variable names are kind of ugly because I'm just consuming a public API. Once again, I'm just mimicking those. And then, of course, the name of the airport. And then we have things like the position, right? The location. So latitude and longitude. And then we'll have an iterable of runways, right? And we'll call this runaways. Yeah, that's good. Runways. Yeah, that's not bad. Okay. Now, we do want to store this. As I mentioned, this will be stored in a MongoDB database, and we'll make this the ID. And that should be pretty happy. Looks good to me. And then, of course, we want to define our repository interface. So we'll call this our airport repository, and we'll extend our reactive CRUD repository. We're going to be storing objects of type airport with ID of type string, and voila, there we go. Now, to build our internal API, that's the next place I usually go. We want to create a service here, right? So service, and we'll call this our airport service. And what do we need here? Well, we'll need our airport repository. Yeah, that'll work. And then, of course, we need to create a constructor so we can inject that. That's good. We also, though, will need a private string token because, again, we need a security token, which our config service will provide us so that we can access this secured but public API, right? So I'm going to use @value to grab that. There we go. Make sure I get that closing brace there. Sometimes I leave that off and it seems really unhappy for some reason. So I'm going to just pull in the AVWX token. If I can't find that, I'm going to just say, hey, there's no valid token. And that's my little cue to myself that, hey, somehow I've missed that or it's not picking that up or whatever. So let's define our service. Now, what are the things that we'll probably want to do? Public, final, and then we'll want to be able to retrieve a flux of all airports. Now, if you're not familiar with reactive streams, then this is probably let me give you like a 30-second introduction. If you have an imperative or a blocking application, typically for instance, on returning a return value from a method, you'll return an object of type T, or maybe an iterable of type T. When it comes to reactive streams and non-blocking mechanisms, what you will typically have, and this is a very imprecise comparison, it's not 100%, but I like to tell people to think of, instead of returning an object of type T, you would return a mono of type T, and that's just 1, 0, or 1 values, right? A flux is 0 to n values. So think of it kind of like an iterable of type T. So an iterable of airport in this case. And you can have 0 to n values. The difference is that you're not waiting for all of those to be gathered before they're sent back, right? And this is a gross oversimplification, but that's kind of how I like to introduce it to folks who are maybe new to that concept. So you have a publisher, which can be a mono or a flux, but they roughly correspond to that object of type T and that iterable of type T. So we're going to be returning 0 to n airports here. And I just like to call methods like this get all airports, and we'll return repo.find all. Super simple. We keep it simple, right? So public final mono of airport. And once again, we want to return 0 or 1 values, right? So there we go. Get airport by ID. And of course, we'll provide an ID. And we should return repo.find by ID, that ID. And again, that's pretty easy. Now, I actually want to be able to populate this. How are we doing on time? Do I have time to? We're tight on time. I may just keep this very lean. If I want to come back and add to this, I can, but I don't want to run out of time. I'd rather have an excess of time. We can come back and embellish this a bit. So I'll keep it pretty tight. The next thing, of course, now that we've got our internal API defined, we want to define our external API that our service or instances of our service is exposing to the outside world. So I'll create a controller, and this will be our airport controller. And of course, we want to, in our controller, we want to be able to access our service because we're going to use that internal API that we built for our external API. So private final airport service. And then we want to provide our external API, which kind of corresponds with our internal API for the time being, right? So public flux of airport, final flux. Okay, so we'll just call this airports and return service dot get all airports. Annotations are not allowed here. That's interesting. Okay, well, it just took a little time to catch up. So I'm thinking, where are GetMapping annotations allowed if they're not in a controller? But okay, that's fine. I just took it a moment. So we have a GetMapping. I want to grab actually, I want to grab an airport by its ID. And then I may create one more. So public final, this will be a mono of airport. And airport port by ID. And this, of course, is a path variable, string ID. And we'll use that to return our service, get airport by ID. And then what I like to do sometimes is create a list, because sometimes that's useful, right? So we'll get a list of airports, public final flux of string, and we'll do list of airports. We'll return service.get all airports, but then what I'm going to do is take each of those airports and I'm going to map them. So we'll take our airport and we'll do airport.name, plus, and then the airport dot, actually, let's do the ICAO first. Why don't we do that? ICAO. There we go. That looks reasonable. And then I also like to, just for formatting, have our line. And then what I also like to do, kind of forgot that I like to do this, but I like to show what's happening as it happens. So that way we can get a log of things and we can see what's happening as it happens. Certainly not anything you have to do, but I do like to just show what's happening as we're running this. So I think that's all we need. Let's go ahead and try it. And what should happen is it should go out and grab its config from the config service. It can say, hey, I'm an airport service, as you can see from the properties. I'm an airport service. Give me my properties. The config service will dutifully hand over those properties. It will register with Eureka. And then we can see this, if we're very fortunate, right there. Look at that. Okay, so we have discovery service. It's listing itself, which is not, any big deal, but we have our airport service here so that we can see here, and this is our, let me expand this. So we can see that this is our health check. Actuator is just giving us the info. It's saying, yep, I'm up and running here. So if we want to go in and see what our endpoints are, if we just hit the main endpoint, then we see all of the class Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, the B, C, and D towered airports within, I think I did a 50-mile radius of St. Louis, which is where I'm based. So we can see that there's a number of airports sitting out here that are towered airports and a lot more that are just what they call uncontrolled airports. But these are the big ones, right? Or the bigger ones. And we have several runways that are identified, the length in feet, the width in feet. So we have all of these that we can peruse. Now, if we want just the list, and this doesn't show up as well in a browser, so let me go ahead and just do an airport, and we'll do KCPS, which is our St. Louis downtown airport. It's a small airport that sits right down by the arch. Really, really nice place to fly in and out of. So it's there. Now, if I want to grab this, and we'll go out to our, there we go. Let me go to a different, there we go. Well, let's just open another tab. Why not? So I'm going to just do an HTTP, and I want to get the list. Oh, not airport list. Wrong endpoint. There we go. So now we can see just the list itself, which is kind of what I like to show with that. Nice, short, sweet, and to the point. So that's our airport service. So we have a service built that goes out and grabs from the config service the properties, including the encrypted property that lets it, the token that allows it to hit that external service. It goes and looks up other services in the service registry. It registers itself, and then life goes along merrily. It serves its purpose. What I want to do now is create another service that has a similar service, has similar capabilities, and then I want to tie them together and see how they all work together to kind of answer the mail as a whole. So that's our airport service. Let's go ahead and go back and create another one. And I'll go to the service. Instead of the airport service, I want to create a weather service. Weather. I'll shorten it, WX. All right. So this will still need to be a config client, a discovery client. We'll still be using Reactive Web and Actuator. I won't be using MongoDB. I don't necessarily need that. So I'm going to drop that off there. I'm not going to be storing anything. And I'm going to generate the application. Again, drop it in the same place. Go back and open that. And we'll open that in our IDE as well. There we go. And once again, define our Spring application name. This is our weather service, and it will get the weather service properties based on our Spring config import, which is pointing to our config server at http://localhost 8888. All right, let's go to our application code. Once again, I'm going to just create a bean here. Bean, if I can spell, web client, client, return web client.create. And I'm going to point this to HTTPS again, avwx.rest/API. And I'm going to stop there because I'm going to be pulling a lot of different information for this. Now, the next thing I like to do once again, is define the domain. So I'm going to create some records. And in this case, I'm going to start with a METAR record. Now, what is a METAR, you might be asking? METAR stands for Meteorological Aerodrome Report, which is just to say the current weather conditions. I don't know why they don't say that. I guess METAR is shorter. So I'm also going to create a domain class or a domain record called TAF, which is a Terminal Aerodrome Forecast, which is, again, just a forecast, right? So what typically happens if I were to query the weather at a particular airport, I'll get one METAR, that's the current set of conditions, and I'll get potentially numerous TAFs, numerous forecasts, because the forecast may be for, clear skies until 5 p.m., and then from 5 to 7 p.m., we see clouds rolling in. And from 7 p.m. to midnight, it may be just torrential downpours. So you'll have multiple forecasts for what is anticipated as coming in terms of weather. And then we'll have things like our time, and we'll create a record for that. And then also we'll have things like our visibility, which is always in the forecast, or hopefully in the forecast. And then things like our wind direction, very important as a pilot. And then our wind speed, also very important. So our wind speed, many of these things actually just have what they call a representation, which is just a string. It's an encoded string. And this harkens back to the days in aviation when, well, in all aspects of life, when data feeds were very expensive in terms of both bandwidth and cost, frankly. So you had the need to get specific data to the cockpit, between cockpit and ground, but you didn't want to waste a lot of bandwidth to do it. So everything came through in a very terse, and it is terse, it's not concise, it's terse, representation that's encoded that covers hopefully all of the basis of the information that you need. So for our time, we have things like our zoned date time we'll have, and that is again, DT. I'm just going with what the external API provides. And then once again, we have our representation. I actually forgot to include our forecast because a TAF will have multiple forecasts, right? Ooh, that got ugly when I hit automatic formatting. Ooh. So we'll have a string. This is our raw information for our forecast. And then we have a start time that the forecast is actually good for. It begins, and an end time, right? And then we'll have flight rules. And this is whether it's visual flight rules where you can keep your head up and look outside and see the horizon, or if you have to just focus on instruments and navigate entirely blind, so to speak, because it's zero visibility, clouds all around surrounding you. So we have our flight rules, we have our visibility, we'll call this cleverly enough visibility, wind direction, and that will be wind direction, and wind speed, and that will be wind speed. And then, of course, we have an iterable of string, which just has other information that might be passed along as hopefully potentially useful to us. And then in our TAF, we'll have our start time that the forecast is good for, start time, and then an end time for all of the forecasts, I should say. And time, and then an iterable of forecasts, and we'll call this just forecast. And then for our METAR, we have a raw string that incorporates all of the essential data. We'll have a time that it is valid, just one time, because again, it's a current condition, right? And then our flight rules at the current time. So flight rules, and that should do it. Now, what I need to do is, in this case, we don't really have an internal versus external API. We're only servicing external requests. So I'm just going to create a REST controller. We'll call this our weather controller. And then once again, I want to bring in a value here, which is our dollar avwx.token. And once again, no valid token if it's not there, and we'll just point this to a string, once again called token. We want to inject our web client. Actually, there we go. And then we'll want to expose this, an API. So I'm going to do a GetMapping here. I want to point to a METAR, allow the retrieval of the current conditions. So this will be a public final mono, because we're just getting one. Again, current conditions, there's one of them. So we want to retrieve, come on, there you go. Retrieve METAR. And of course, we'll retrieve that based on a path variable, string ID, which I've defined there. And I'll return client.get.URI. And I want to bring in the METAR slash ID question token equals token, and I'm going to use these placeholders so I can bring in the ID and the token and just insert them there and retrieve that value, and then convert the body to a mono of type METAR. And then I want to, once again, log, just because I like to see what's going on. Now, if I don't provide any value, what I'd like to do is just grab a default METAR. So public final mono METAR default METAR retrieve or return. I'm going to call the retrieve METAR, and I'm going to pass in KSTL, which is the large class Bravo airport in the area, which would get us at least a good kind of centerpiece of our weather service. And then I want to be able to pull in the TAFs, right? The forecast, because we have the current conditions. Let's expose the TAFs for access. And instead of going to METAR, I will go here to TARF, and retrieve TAF. And this actually also is a mono, because a TAF will consist of multiple forecasts. And of course, we'll call this external API here and retrieve a TAF. There we go. Mono METAR. Knew I missed something. There we go. And that should be much happier now. And there we go. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we have. We're close on time, but I think we can do this, because this is kind of setting up the complexity behind the scenes. And then we get to take full advantage of the power of Spring Cloud and the cloud to go ahead and see what we get out of the other end, which is really, really amazing. And this is where that kind of force multiplier comes into being. I refreshed Eureka, just kind of forcibly refreshed. We see that we now have a weather service. I pop it up. It's getting our actuator endpoint to tell us that, yes, it's here. Everything is working. Or is it? Let's go ahead and hit our default METAR. We see that KSTL is showing there. That's good. That's exactly what we expected. Winds are out of 170, so almost out of the southeast. 14 knot winds, gusting to 26 knots. That's substantial. Scattered clouds at 8,500 feet. You always drop the last two digits. Scattered at 25,000 feet, et cetera, and so on. Now, if we want to go here and check METAR for KSUS, a Spirit of St. Louis Airport in Chesterfield. Did I? Let me back that up. Maybe I typoed there. /METAR /KSUS. Yeah, I did. Apparently I typoed. So here we have our METAR for KSUS. Now, if we want to see what the forecast is, we just go to our TAF endpoint, and we see that the overall TAF start and end times are here. And then for each forecast, it breaks it into a separate one. So you have different conditions that are going to be reported at different times. And we have 4 different forecasts that are included in this one TAF at this point for this one particular airport. So that was pretty cool. Actually, it's going out and grabbing those weather forecasts and current conditions based on whatever we specify. But now what I want to do is combine those two and use the service registry to help make that connection easily and painlessly on our part. So I'm going to now create a condition service, and everything should stay largely the same because I want to use a lot of the same things. So let's go ahead and generate that. And here we go, conditions, open. Here is where we start to see some of that payoff. And I feel kind of guilty calling this hard work because I don't feel like we worked that hard to get to this point. But there was a certain amount of effort that goes into building an interface with an external API. So I guess there is some work involved there, right? But now we're going to see where this really makes life so much easier on us as developers when we start tying this all together using Spring Cloud behind the scenes. So once again, I want to define the Spring application name. This is our conditions service, so it will get any properties from the config service that are specifically provided for condition services, and then our Spring config import, which points to config server and http://localhost 8888. Right, and let's go here and go to our code now. In this case, what I want to do is create a bean. And now that I'm wanting to access other services, I want this to leverage our client-side load balancing. So Spring Cloud Load Balancer. And I'm going to create a web client builder. And I'm going to make this one step removed. So I'll just call this load balanced builder. It doesn't really matter. I just like to leave middle notes for myself, little love letters that keep me on track what I want to provide and let me know right off the top of my head or top of my code what I am providing. So I'm going to use web client.builder. Yeah, there we go. Now back to the domain. This is a little simpler because I've done the hard work in my other services that I'm going to be accessing behind the scenes. So I'm just going to create an airport record. And really for the airport record, I don't need a lot. I'll come back to that in a moment. So record METAR, once again, METAR, I don't really need a lot. And of course, time, and this is a zone date time, and this is our DT, and then our representation. And then for our METAR, all I really need is the raw representation once again. And then the time that it's valid, and then the flight rules. That's all I really care about for my summary, right? Rules, spelling counts. And then for the airport, what I really want is the ICAO code. Now, that gets me what I need here. I just need to be able to access this and tie this all together. So I'm going to create a REST controller, and this will be our conditions controller class. And then here, I don't need the token, our external token, because the other services handle all those external calls. I'm just dealing with them and letting them do that back-end work, or external work, I should say. So I do want to inject our web client builder, and we'll call that builder. And then what I want to also do is just create a couple of web clients, and I'll call this our airport client. And then I'm going to just create a weather client as well. And then here in our constructor, I'm going to set the airport client equal to builder dot, we want the base URL, right? And I'm going to point this at http://airport, spelling does still count, service. And I'm going to build it. Now you're looking at that saying, that's not a valid URL. However, we're going to rely on our service registry to fill that in and make that connection with an instance. This is why the load balance bean is so important. It's going to connect it to an available instance of the requested service. And it's going to handle that for us. So again, we don't have to. It provides a lot of that heavy lifting for us. I'm going to do the same thing for our weather service. And now I want to just create our endpoints. So I'm going to create a couple endpoints, and I'm just going to create a greeting endpoint because I'm crazy like that. I like to see things and make sure they're working. So we'll call this greeting, and then say return conditions are great. But then what I really want, some kind of a summary, right? And I want to return a flux of METARs, and we'll call this get conditions summary. And then let's go ahead and import Flux so it knows what it's getting there. So I'm going to return, I'm going to use the AP client, and I'm going to get those values. I'm going to retrieve those values, right? I'm going to convert that body to a flux of airports. And then I'm going to flat map that. So each of those airports that comes out of there, I'm going to use that to access the weather client, and I'm going to pass in the Yuri here. I want to add this to and grab the METAR, right? For the, if typing would help, ID, right? And then ID. Let's see, actually it'd be ap.iko. I want to grab that and bring in the ICAO. And that's fine. And let's see, and then body off on my get Yuri. Let's see, retrieve.body. There we go. Body to mono. This is a METAR. And of course, who doesn't like to log things when they're done? If you don't typo, log. There we go. All right. So what's not to love? Let's try this and see what happens. Once this starts, I'll go back over to Eureka. We'll refresh. There we go. There's our condition service. I'm going to go ahead and go there. We see that it's up and running. That's always a good sign. And I'm going to just go to the root, and we see conditions are great, as we knew they would be, right? And I'm going to grab the summary. And we'll get a summary of all of our different airports and the current conditions at each one, the flight rules, and of course the time, the date and time. And here's the raw METAR, which tells us that, again, here are the wind conditions and the cloud conditions and all of that. So those are that's kind of the payoff. Like I said, we built these services that reached out to the outside world. We used an encrypted value to get that, both the airport information as well as the weather information, weather forecast. Then we have a condition service that ties it all together. Now, you're probably wondering how I can top that. I'm going to top it right now and create one more thing. And then I want to show you how it all deploys to the cloud, or how it all runs in the cloud, really, because again, time is fairly short. But I want to go back here, and I'm going to create a gateway service, because again, right now, all I'm doing is getting to each one of these, the external APIs directly. So that's not great practice, right? So gateway, and then I don't necessarily need the, what don't I need in here? Yeah, probably, I don't necessarily need the, reactive web, because what I want to do is replace that with the gateway dependency, which brings that in, actually. So that should do it. And once again, drop that there. So here, gateway, open, and pull that up. And this is, again, we've done the heavy lifting already so far. So this is not a hard heavy lift at all. So let's go ahead to our application properties, our spring.application.name, so we can identify this as our gateway service, and Spring config import, config server, and http://localhost 8888. We go to our app. Now we can run it basically just like this. We don't have to do anything. What I like to do, though, just for my personal benefit, is just show gateway controller, so I can do a GetMapping and just do a public final string, like a status, like a liveness check, liveness. So return gateway is up. Now, again, this is optional. Don't have to do this, but I like to do this because that way I can show you this. When we start this up, we should see this show up here in Eureka, and of course we do. We can pull up the gateway service. We see that it is up and running. Actually, that gives us, I guess, enough. But if I just do this, we see the gateway is up. Now, what the gateway does, because we have routings, if we go back over to, well, let's do this way, right? Let's go to our gateway service that I'm pulling in from our config service. Our properties show that we have routes defined. So that if I want to get to an airport service, for instance, I append /airport, and then anything after that, it strips the prefix and passes it off, the requests off in a load balance fashion using our client-side load balancer to the airport service. Same thing with the weather service. If I just add /weather and something else, it strips off the /weather and passes on the request to the weather service and returns whatever we get back. So if I do that here, well, that's our airport. Let me close that. There, gateway. There we go. For instance, if I go to airport and KSUS, let's see. So airport. Oh, yes, because I forgot. I actually have to have the extra airport in there for my API. If I want to go and pull up the weather, I want to pull up the METAR for KCPS. Great. Now, if I want to go to the condition service, that is routed. So conditions and summary. We get back our full summary. And once we get it all, then it just reformats it pretty for us and in a pretty fashion so we can see it very nicely. And that all works brilliantly. So the gateway, again, you externalize that configuration. You put all of your routes here. It draws those in. You can update them in one place, refresh, and everything is routing the way it's supposed to. Now, everything that I've shown you so far has been local, right? And that's a very powerful concept from a developer's perspective. But of course, at some point, we're going to want to deploy that to the cloud. So this is the build better, deploy faster service that I've created under Azure Spring Apps. I actually want to show you something on the slides here first. Here's the 10,000 foot view, because in the old days when Pivotal Cloud Foundry was a thing, and of course we've had several things, evolutions and outgrowths of that, but VMware and Microsoft worked together to create a natural home, a target deployment for your Spring Cloud-based Spring Boot applications. So when you have a complex set of distributed microservices, you need a place to host those. And we don't necessarily, as developers, want to get into the weeds of Kubernetes. We just want its power, right? We want all of it offers, but we don't want to have to become full-time Kubernetes administrators. And with VMware and Microsoft's partnership, what we wound up doing is creating Azure Spring Apps, which gives you a place to host and to deploy your applications. It ties all of this together. You have the Tanzu build service. You have different agents. You have the service registry, config server, as I showed you. You can configure a gateway. You have various different metrics, logs, tracing, reporting. You have a lot of capabilities that are built in and just let you focus on deploying maximum value for your customers and for your community. So it's pretty simple, right? We just provide the support, we provide the home for it, and you provide the code. It doesn't get much better than that. Again, running all on Kubernetes. So yeah, make the cloud work for you. And I'm actually going to keep the demo, so to speak, kind of short. I do want to show you, though, that you have the config server here. It just points once again to a GitHub repository right there. And you can define what label that it's connecting to, what different branch, what have you. You have networking rules. You can define storage. You can define different keys. And that's one thing, because when you move to the cloud, you can take advantage of Azure Key Vault, which means that even though you're still encrypting the information, you never see it. It's not exposed sitting out there, for instance, in the GitHub repository, as my one key is now. Even though it's encrypted, it's still visible. This just makes it even less visible. It's just specifically exposed to your application from Key Vault, and you never have to see that anywhere. It's never visible to you or to anybody else looking. If we go in and look at the apps, we see that it's the same applications running. I can go to my gateway service, for instance. I can pull that up, and we're already over, so I'm going to keep this blissfully short here. But if I want to just go here and do a conditions summary, we see the same thing, right? It just comes out. It's not pretty formatting, but if I want the pretty formatting, I just go back here to my my terminal and do an HTTP and just pull it in there. Same thing. It's all there. As a developer, you get to focus on what you can deploy with maximum value, which is your code, your working code, your systems, and let the platform handle the platform. You do have access to all of it, but again, it's sort of like Spring Boot. In most cases, you don't need to tweak everything. You let the auto configuration handle that for you, handle most of the heavy lifting, which is an awesome, awesome thing. Okay, so with that, let me go back here. If you want to know more, please check out the repos at Build Better, Deploy Faster, and that's kind of the parent repo. Build Better Config has the configuration properties files, the YAML files. These do need updating. I updated everything for the talk. I just haven't pushed the updated code. So the code out there is not quite as fresh as I'd like it to be, but I will be fixing that shortly. If you want to follow the book on Twitter, it's there. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm there. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, reach out to me, well, anywhere, but that's probably your fastest route. So with that, thanks for coming, and we'll cover any questions, comments, feedback, and then whatever you think of 5 minutes later, just ping me somewhere else.
Well, Mark, thank you, my friend. That was amazing. And I just want to say, I was always under the impression that consuming raw or undercooked meat might increase the risk of foodborne illness. And then I realized that might be a different kind of thing. But I really believe air travel requires far more of these acronyms. I mean, it's far too clear when you look at the output as to exactly what's going on, as to what direction the wind is coming from. And yeah, it's good times. There was one question about where you got your pilot training. I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different options out there. I mean, when I was doing a lot of, I'll detail the private pilot certificate, and everything else kind of mirrors that at each step you go up the ladder. But for the private pilot certificate, you have to pass basically 3 exams. One is the written exam, which means you need to study and internalize all of this very different knowledge from anything that you're used to. And you have to pass that at a certain level in order to proceed. And these can be done in any different order, but I'm just kind of mentioning them in whatever order comes out. So the written exam has to be passed. You have to also have a certain number of hours of flight training from any certified flight instructor, whether it's through an official school or an individual like freelancer who hangs out their shingle, or even an airline certified organization. If you're like, somebody coming out of university or even high school and you want to go straight to the airlines and you have zero experience, sometimes the airlines have a particular training. I don't know how to refer to that other than an organization where they have a flight school and does everything to take you zero to airlines. So, I mean, there are a lot of different ways you can get that flight training, the hours and the practical flying knowledge. And then once you complete that and the written, you have 2 more exams. And there's a minimum number of flight hours that you have to take, 40 for the private pilot's license. And that includes like some night flying and such, some instrument conditions type things. Very limited, but so the other thing is you have to, once you're done with all that, then you have to take an oral exam where the designated pilot examiner from the FAA grills you. And that can be fairly straightforward to insanely intense. I've had both of those experiences, but I mean, it feels intense regardless, but
Right.
Anyway, and then you get to go, once you've completed the written and the oral and all of your hours, then you get to do the flight test. So you have to actually go do the flight test, and they have to sign off on you after that. And after that, then you get your temporary certificate, and then eventually the permanent ones. When I went for my instrument training, similar type of thing. You have different number of hours and different types of training, but you have the written, the hours of actual flying training. You have an oral exam, which the guy was just ruthless for hours, grilled me. And then we went and flew, and that was exhausting as well. And that was just a long Saturday.
Yeah, I bet.
But you can go any number of places. Like I said, I mean, if you have somebody who's a certified flight instructor and they're current, or if you're going for an instrument rating, a certified flight instructor for instruments, CFII, you can take one-on-one, or you can go through like ground schools. Our local community college has one every so often, I think twice a year, that does a ground school. And then of course you can go through flight training at like a registered flight school too. So it depends. Everybody has a different spin on what works for them.
Right.
I did a lot of my ground school stuff via online ground school because I was traveling a lot, right? So I mean, you kind of squeeze it in when you can, and one place to do that is on a plane.
Right.
While you're flying.
Can relate.
Flying commercially, I mean.
So. Yeah, you shouldn't be studying while flying your plane. That's
no. Although I have a friend who threw out a kind of funny thing because he took a book. It's like how to land an airplane. So he's up in the airplane. He's like, yeah.
Well, I do want to point out we've had an amazing audience here today with folks from all over. We had someone from Colombia, we had Mexico, we had Pakistan. We had 2 folks from Tunisia.
Wow.
We had South Africa. And, just knowing some of the time zone changes here, that's really impressive to have had such a huge smattering of people. And I will certainly echo Simon's comment. Thank you for a great talk, and Deshaun as well gives you the big thumbs up. So we've got some fun hecklers here in the audience. There was one question that just creeped in, and I guess it's fairly vague in terms of, what can you say about Spring Cloud versus Service Mesh, aka Istio? So if you have any thoughts on that, we could chat a bit.
Different approaches to solve the same problem. I mean, it's not necessarily one is bad or one is good. It's just a different, perhaps a different take on things. And by the way, and that's kind of what I mentioned earlier, just in passing, was that many of these things are, I don't want to say they're interchangeable, but there are different ways you can solve the same problem that all work together. So Service Mesh, Istio is an option you can employ as well. I kind of show that the middle path is like, I can do all the same things in Kotlin too, but I show it all in Java. So that's just the option that I chose for today.
Totally. All right. Well, let me just do one more quick spin here. And okay, we got one more. Thank you very much. Well, you bet. My pleasure, Arnold. Thanks for hanging out with us. We appreciate it. Yeah. Before we go, I do have to chime in on, wait, we've got one other. Oh my, they're from everywhere. I mean, this is just amazing. Wow. And Munich too. I mean, my gosh, Mark.
Oh my gosh.
We went global. We
did.
It's worldwide. Colombia. I mean, this is just amazing. I am just so stunned that you all are hanging out with us. That is fantastic. A couple things I want to talk about before we disappear here. One, of course, if you're looking for more of this kind of material and you want to even get down to the end of doing certification type work, we got Spring Academy. That's certainly available to you. And I got to talk about Spring 1 coming to VMware Explore here in Vegas in August. Very much looking forward to that. So, just to toss that into the mix, this is usually the time of year you got to start talking to your management chain about your educational spend for the year. So try to take advantage of that. And oh gosh, Switzerland, London, Pennsylvania, Berlin. Even Germany. We've got London. I mean, is there any place not represented? Antarctica. We probably don't have anybody from Antarctica.
I'm waiting.
We'll try harder next time, I guess.
We will.
So, all right. Well, without further ado, I think we can call it a day. Thank you. The pleasure as always. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the same meet space here real soon. So
hopefully,
excited about that, my friend. And I'll just say travel safe, buddy.
Yeah, you too. I don't know or care who gets to buy the first coffee, but we'll trade them back and forth.
Coffee will be procured.
Buenos Aires. All right.
Oh gosh, really? Look at that. It's just every time. Italy, Buenos Aires. This is amazing. What an amazing collection we have. This is fantastic.
Well, hey, everyone reach out on Twitter and let's keep the conversation going.
Heck yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again, my friend. Appreciate it and hope to see you all soon. Cheers.
Likewise. Cheers.